If you look at my stats on chess.com, you'll see that I primarily played one opening since my first game 2 years ago, and that opening is the London system. The London has become one of the most popular d4 openings in recent years, and even though some accuse it of being boring, there's a reason lots of people choose to play it, from complete beginners to super grandmasters and even world champions. Now, openings have a relatively small impact on a person's skills, but I thought it would be interesting to see how my understanding of this one opening, plus my board vision and thought process, changed as I climbed the rating ladder. In this video, we'll be looking at some games I played starting when my rapid rating was around 800 and ending with one where my rating was around 1500. So as a beginner, the London worked really well for me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is a setup-based opening, which means at this level, there aren't a lot of tricks and sharp lines that you're going to be falling into. In general, you're going to develop your pieces the same way pretty much every time, sort of reacting to your opponent's moves if they get too aggressive, but you're generally going to get the same setup every single time, and the main thing with that is you're getting out of the opening alive. Now, especially because I was playing exclusively 10-minute games, time was a huge factor in my games, and so if I could spend less time in the opening and then save more time for positions later in the middle game or the end game where I actually had to think because the positions were a lot more complicated, that was really good for me. At this level, you really just need to have a basic understanding of opening principles, developing your pieces, getting your king to safety, and then controlling the center. And the London does all of these things. You start with your d-pawn, and then the main feature of the London is bringing this bishop out to f4, and this does a couple of things. First of all, it controls this nice diagonal, which can be really helpful later in the game with different kinds of tactics. It also helps to immediately take control of the center, and a lot of times in the London, the fight is really going to be fought on this e5 square. You're either going to want to put a knight there, or at the very least, be controlling that square very well with your pawns and pieces and prevent black from pushing e5 themselves. Another thing this move does, though, is that it removes the protection of the b pawn, and in a lot of more advanced lines, you're going to see black bringing this queen out to b6 and going after this b-pawn. And this is where the London gets out of the boring territory and becomes really tactical and sharp. And both sides really have to know what they're doing, because a lot of times for black, this pawn might be free, but it's actually a poison pawn and you don't want to take it because your queen's going to get trapped. But a lot of times you're not going to see those kind of sharp attacking lines at this level, because black doesn't know that one of the most testing lines in the London is to immediately push the c-pawn, or at least in the first couple of moves, and immediately strike at white's center. c5 is actually a very important move in a lot of d-pawn openings, but again, at this level, a lot of your opponents aren't going to know that. At least in my experience, black often will block the pushing of this pawn by putting the knight here, and we'll see that's exactly what happens in this game. So we continue developing. As you see, black brings the knight out to c6, which is an inaccurate move, but at this level, it's really hard to know exactly how to punish that, because it's more of a positional mistake, not allowing the queen to get out and attack some of these weak pawns over on the queen side. And it's not something you can just punish in one move and, like win a piece or win an exchange. It's basically allowing white to continue doing whatever we want. So we continue with our plan of creating this pawn pyramid. We'll eventually push the c-pawn as well and create this beautiful pawn chain, just solidifying the entire position. We develop the bishop to d3, so it has nice vision on both sides of the board. And then this is something that I knew I needed to react to, that wherever this dark squared bishop is going to go, you need to pay attention. So the move that I chose in the game, and the move that I often still play even in my games today, is actually rocking the bishop back. You almost never want to take this bishop, not because it allows black to capture with the queen and it's, an equal trade, but because black can actually capture with the pawn. And the entire fight of the London system is trying to get a knight onto the e5 square, or at least control it. And with a pawn there, you're never going to put your knight there. So it's actually better to rock the bishop back, and even if we get doubled pawns, we can actually open up for this rook, even in some cases castle on the queen side, and just go for a very belligerent attack on the king side, especially if black castles into it. So that's actually exactly what happened in this game. Black took the bishop, I captured back with the h-pawn, again opening up for this rook. And now notice we already have two pieces aiming at this h7 square, and if black wants to castle this way, they're going to have to prevent any kind of shenanigans on that side of the board. So black pushed h6, I continued with my development. This is usually where the knight goes in this opening so that, again, we can push the c-pawn and create our nice pyramid. This also allows this knight to eventually take the place of this knight when we jump onto the square e5, so that we have extra protection all over the square and we're just really controlling the e5 square. So here, black got a little bit aggressive, jumping the knight into the center, and this is very simply just a matter of miscounting or some kind of miscalculation, because we just went a pawn after takes, and takes. Black pushes the f-pawn, and at the time, I don't think I really realized how weakening of a move this is. We can already start bringing the bishop in and force the king to move so they won't be able to castle. We can also consider bringing the knight up here and jumping in here to attack the rook. There's just all kinds of threats that this pawn push is allowing us to make, but I, at this level, didn't really understand how to take advantage of this inaccuracy, and so I moved my queen up because I'm not going to be castling on the king side, right, because this isn't super safe anymore. It also looks like black might be considering a pawn storm on this side of the board, even though they're pretty far away from castling themselves, but that's kind of what this pawn push is indicating to me. So I think I just wanted to castle as soon as possible, and so after this pawn push, I did so, I castled. We have a trade of pawns in the center, and now black brings the bishop out, pinning the knight to the queen, so this knight, of course, can't move because the bishop will take our queen. So this is actually a huge mistake, because this allows for a very nice tactic, which I don't think I was quite advanced enough to see at the time. I was also pretty weak generally in tactics around this level because I just didn't really study them that much. And this tactic has to do with the fact that the queen is in line with black's king. So as soon as we move this bishop anywhere, it will be a check, a discovery check on the black king, and so we can potentially win material. And so the best move here actually is to give a double check, meaning the king has to move. There isn't a way to, just block one of the checks if you have two checks on your king. And we can win material with this immediately by taking the knight. Again, this is a double check on the black king, and so the king would have had to move, and then we're just up a knight. But in the game, I didn't see this, and instead I pushed the pawn. So a blindness I would say that I had at this level that really doesn't pertain to the opening, but it will come up in other London type positions, is that I didn't look for checks every single move. And that's actually really important so that you can find tactics like the one I missed. So the game goes on, I end up blundering a pawn and then kind of winning it back. But I'm not going to go too much further in depth because this is really just about the opening. But I will show you the really nice ending to this game, which after some trades, we end up in, let's find it, this position. And instead of protecting my bishop, I made the brilliant move, or at least chess.com calls it a brilliant move, of abandoning my poor bishop on this side of the board, but bringing my queen back, hoping to checkmate the king, which after black took the bishop, I achieved just a couple of moves later. So let's move into our next game. You'll see again, at this level too, we're seeing this inaccurate knight c6 move. And in this case, we have a more symmetrical setup. So I continued with my setup, and here's another type of inaccuracy you'll see at this level, moving a piece twice in the opening. Black just wants to attack this knight, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. I developed my bishop, and if black wanted to move their bishop a third time, I would happily take with the queen. But instead, black opted to really solidify the positioning of this bishop by pushing the f-pawn. Now again, this is already quite a bit better for white, and there are some reasons that are a little bit tougher to understand, but I think the main one that's like the most visually obvious is that now that both the f-pawn and the d-pawn have been pushed, this knight has a beautiful outpost square. Again, we keep going back to the square, e5. And because these pawns are both down, there's no pawn that can kick this knight away. And even though this knight can recapture, we can eventually refill with another piece there, and we have really nice control over this important center square. So I ended up trading. I think this is a little bit inaccurate because it allowed black to connect these pawns and then gain a tempo on my knight, forcing it to move. I jumped onto e5, black took, I recaptured with the bishop, and now a couple of moves later, I made the inaccurate move of putting my knight on c3, which, just like in black's case, we don't want to block this c-pawn because eventually we would love to chip away at black's center by pushing this pawn. So I'm not exactly sure what the plan was. This knight really has no prospects over here. Black kept solidifying their center, which again, I believe is extremely inaccurate because they still have so many pieces sitting on the back rank and their king is just super exposed in the middle of the board. I moved my queen out for some unknown reason. Maybe I was trying to castle queenside and get some kind of attack going. Again, not really sure what I was thinking here. And then black moved the dark squared bishop out with an attempt to trade it off. But the problem with moving this bishop out is that it left the protection of the g-pawn. This bishop is perfect spot to attack this pawn, and that's exactly what I did. I took and was threatening to take the rook, and there's no way for black to prevent that. Black tried to maybe soften the blow by sacrificing the bishop, hoping maybe I would take that instead of the rook. But the problem is my pawn is also attacking the square, so what I should have done is just take that and then take the rook. But instead, I was so excited that I won a rook that I just took it, and, I'm up in exchange. It's not as good as it could have been, but, at this level, it's pretty good to be up any material. I castled, black pushed this pawn, probably trying to just preemptively trade off the doubled pawns. But the problem with pushing all these pawns on the king side is that this gives us a really nice diagonal that we can come attack because the king is not castled. And that's exactly what I did. I brought my queen out to the side of the board. I'm actually quite impressed that I found this move because, again, looking for these kind of tactical checks were not my strong suit at this level. Black is forced to move the king. So I took this pawn with check, black brought the knight out to protect, and then I essentially just started trading down. So, when you are up with the material, it's really good often to just trade down, and eventually you'll be left with just more pieces than your opponent. Black moved the king probably to get out of this pin over here, but the problem with this is that it undefends the knight, and so now the knight's being attacked twice, only defended once, and so I win the knight, and just a couple of moves later, I ended up winning even more material. Again, not the most accurate moves, but I won the queen and eventually found a mate. So again, you'll see not only at this level, but at all levels, lots of times aggression and just very simple opening mistakes like moving pieces twice or inaccurate placement of pieces can be decisive even a little bit later in the game. Speaking of aggression, moving on to our next game, this is probably the most aggressive game we're going to see today. Again, this knight on c6, what is it doing? Why do so many people play it at this level? We gotta push the c-pawn, guys, come on. But we have some almost immediate pawn storm on the king side, which you'll actually see at the higher levels as well. And as white, if you don't know exactly how to deal with that, it can be kind of a problem. I think the key takeaway here is very much psychological. Black is getting extremely aggressive, pushing the pawns. The easiest way to respond to these kind of aggressive attacks is to just get your pieces to safety, not worry about any counterattacks, just sort of diffuse all of the aggression on that side of the board, and then again, just keep going and you should be okay. So I move my bishop to safety, only move here, and black continues with the pawn aggression on this side of the board, hoping to go h4 on the next move and trap my bishop. So I'm essentially forced to play h3 here. So instead of forcing my bishop back, black actually went for another aggressive move here, pushing the g-pawn instead, attacking the knight. I took, black took with the bishop, pinning the knight to the queen. I diffused this pin by bringing the bishop up to e2 instead of its normal square on d3. Black brought the queen up, clearly preparing to castle on the queen side since the king side is pretty much in ruins at this point. I did the same, clearly planning to also castle on the queen side. And at this point, of course, this isn't exact theory. This was essentially me playing by the seat of my pants. But this is generally a good idea, your king side is pretty much ruined. You want to get your king to safety. The more accurate lines in these kinds of positions actually involve leaving the king in the center of the board and waiting for the tension to kind of diffuse before you decide which way to castle. There can also be more pressing matters, like in this situation where, my queen was being attacked, so I had to move it. And then black pushed this pawn, which seems like an okay move. It's preventing white from doing anything over here on b7, but the problem is it's really weakening the light squares around the king. And so I actually immediately took advantage of this and brought the bishop out for check. The king moved in, and I did end up pushing c4. I think the idea here is really just to break open the protection of black's castled king. We can quickly bring the rook in. We can even consider just leaving the king in the center for a while, because black's early aggression with the pawns over on the king side has really just fizzled out to nothing, and now we are the ones that are attacking black's position. So this is about as far as I'll analyze in this game. So I think the main takeaway here is that in the London, there are systems where black can get extremely aggressive with the pawns early on, but it's important to really just get your pieces to safety, and then once you have your pieces sufficiently developed, you can start getting aggressive on the other side of the board because you haven't prematurely pushed your pawns. So this is our final game. In the ones we've looked at so far, a lot of times it's crazy lines that you're not really going to see in a lot of courses or videos. In my experience, I would say it was around this 1500 level where I actually started to see more games that followed main lines. So we start with our basic setup, and finally, Black actually plays the c5 move. Again, this is probably the most testing move of the London, and it's the starting position for a lot of lines that you'll see, again, in courses and videos. So I continued with the pyramid setup, also giving me the option of capturing with either the c-pawn or the e-pawn, and Black immediately alleviated the tension by taking. I took with the e-pawn, and both of these are almost equal as far as evaluation. It's just a matter of the different plans that you're going into in the middle game. So if you take with the c-pawn, you're going to want to bring your rook in, and because you've got this open file, you're a lot faster to get a rook to this file and start an attack down this way. When you take with the e-pawn, you have the advantage of avoiding any checks with this dark squared bishop because you've got a pawn there. You're also preventing the knight from coming in, so this is a little bit more of a prophylactic move. So I went with the slightly safer option, I guess, and took with the e-pawn. Black brought their knight out, and I continued with my development. Not really sure why I didn't bring this bishop out to its usual square. It seems I was playing a little bit more timidly in this game. In the other game where I played bishop e2, there was actually a reason, which was that Black's light scored bishop was pinning the knight to the queen, and that was just to diffuse the tension there. But in this case, I think it was just a matter of me being a little bit sloppy. So Black pushed b6, clearly hoping to bring this bishop out here or here. This is what I would consider a bad piece for Black because all of the pawns are on light squares. This bishop really has no prospects, and so they are probably going to try and trade off their light squared bishop for our really nice light squared bishop, which has a lot of vision, even though it's on not the most accurate square, but it has a lot more control over a lot of important squares on the board. So I castled, Black pushed g6, looking for a double fianchetto with both this bishop and this bishop. But the nice part about having recaptured the d-pawn with the e-pawn is that now this allows the queen to move up and immediately trade off this dark squared bishop. So this is really kind of an ooga booga plan, like a really one-track mind here, but this is exactly what I did. Black castled to protect, and I just took the bishop, Black took back, and it's an effective plan. The game is essentially equal. White has a slight edge, and I would say this is a lot easier to play as White, just because the plans are very simple. We want to get the knight up to e5, eventually develop this knight. This queen is a little bit misplaced, but then bring the rook in, maybe even push the f-pawn just to start an attack right down the center of the board. So this is where I'll stop with the analysis. I eventually went up in exchange, and then Black was unable to hold the rook against 3 pawns endgame. But the way I was studying openings at this time was not too much different than the way I was in some of the previous games we looked at. The difference was the depth of the lines that I was going into, and generally the understanding that I had of the middle game positions that I was getting, simply because I had more experience. Once you play an opening for a long time, you generally know where the pieces want to go and the types of attacks that you can make. There were certainly some sharp lines that I wasn't super familiar with at this time, but again, at this level, I wasn't seeing those main lines, the really testing ones, especially with like queen b6. I really just needed to know the basics of the opening and then learning the middle game plans and learning where your pieces are going to be the most effective. I hope you found this video as interesting as it was for me to make it. It was really fun to look back through the evolution of my understanding of this opening through the rating ladder. If you liked it, please consider subscribing, and also let me know if you'd like me to do a part 2 where I go through games from the 1500 level all the way up to where I am today at the 2000 level. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.